Welcome back to the McCoy Leadership Podcast, elevating your impact through valuable insights and conversations about leadership. Welcome back to another episode of the McCoy Leadership Podcast, and today we have none other than Greg Kaiser with us from down in Florida with the alligators. And Greg is the founder of Management Mastery Solutions. Greg has a dynamic platform dedicated to empowering mid-level and senior managers to transform their leadership styles. And we hope to learn a little bit from Greg today about what some of those skills for modern managers might be, and maybe what some of the differences in relationships between managers and leaders are. Greg, thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how did you end up being where you are today?
Yeah, thank you so much, Amos. And I'll give you the abbreviated version, right? Cliff notes for people that still remember those. So I had a 30-plus year career in corporate, big corporate. And I do like to tell people this story. I really did start in the mailroom. Now, that does date me somewhat, because people are like, well, what's a mailroom? Well, this was before email, but I started the mailroom and it eventually ended up getting to a pretty decent level, an executive level. And after 30 years, I left and went out and started my own consulting business, advisory, consulting, whatever term you like, because one of the things I had observed over the years is managers, and I'm using that term specifically, managers are not particularly well trained.
Yep.
There's all sorts of surgical training that organizations do. You might do conflict resolution training. You might do performance management training. Those are surgical. If you can build out a holistic way of looking at management, one of the things I've found is that it starts to blend into this management leadership. I view that as a very happy overlap for people in a business. I'll take a pause, Amos.
Well, I mean, kind of jumping right into that, how often do you run into managers, frontline managers, that really don't have the proper skills to be, a manager? Maybe, they were the best at what they did when they were an hourly employee, and now they've been bumped up because they were really good, but we never gave them the proper tools to be able to do the job they have. How often do you run into that?
Frequently. So I'll give you an example. I was at one of my nephew's weddings a couple of weeks ago. I'm sitting with one of my cousins. He's the medical examiner for a big city in the Midwest. Excuse me. So he's got a big organization. I'm like, well, Tom, how do you train your managers? What do you mean train my managers? We don't. I'm like, okay, well, you have this big organization. You got hundreds of people in your organization. How would you evaluate your managers? It's like, well, I have two that are pretty good, one that's meh. And he's like, the other ones are new in role, so I haven't figured it out yet. And I'm like, well, do you know why the ones that are meh are meh? Do you know why the ones that are good are good? He's like, I don't know. They just are. Like, you have to break this down into the things that they do. So the ones that you're saying are not at the level you expect them to be at. What are you doing to try to help them?
So what was his answer? I'm very curious about that. Was he doing anything?
No.
And
this is the thing that drives me crazy. Well, they'll figure it out. Like, no, actually, they won't figure it out. Like, you went to medical school and did all those things to learn how to do these things. They're not just going to figure it out. It's not magic. Somebody has to teach them.
In a recent podcast, one of our guests said, we were talking about something similar, and basically they kind of started laughing, and they said, now, to kind of flip that around, because so many leaders in organizations are okay with having 2 good people and 3 meh.
Yeah.
And to flip that around, when you're interviewing people, Because obviously you're okay with it. Would you interview somebody saying, well, I already have two good people, so I'm really just looking for you're okay.
Right.
Or are you interviewing looking for a good candidate? And I thought that was so fascinating when you kind of sit and really think about that. Why are we okay with it? Why do you think so many people are okay with just, I have two good ones. That's enough.
So as I said, spent a fair amount of time in the corporate world. Over time, complacency starts to creep in. And, when companies are going through these huge growth spurts, they're very focused on merit and who's the best person I can get to sustain this outsized rapid level of growth. Then when they start to achieve some success, they get a little bit more complacent. And then they're looking to fill roles. Like, I've got this opening, I have a metric that's going to evaluate me on how fast I fill this role, so I'm going to fill the role. That may not work out well. You'll fill the role, so you'll check the box on that metric, but long term, that's really not what's best for the organization. But that's how I've seen this happen. So, in my consulting work, I work with companies of all different sizes. You don't typically see that in the smaller companies that are trying to get to mid-sized and big. They're still really hungry, and they are focused on getting people that can take them there. So I like the rights, and I did an essay on the blessings and curses of high profit margins. The curse of a high profit margin is you get complacent.
Yep.
And I don't know if you've observed this any of the places you've been. It's a beautiful thing, it gives you all this flexibility. You got high profit margins, you have a lot of cash coming in, your working capital management gets easier. The curse of it is, we're okay.
Where that came out for me the most was during the 06, 07, 08 downturn in the construction industry, the housing bubble bust. And I was in the construction industry at the time as a manufacturer. And during that time, I worked for a very large company in the United States. They were an Irish-held company, and we had to close a lot of facilities. And it was a great opportunity to start to learn how to poise yourself for the next upturn. But what I saw across the country was there were some areas that were poising themselves and preparing for the next upturn. So they were looking at the downturn as an opportunity, because for many years prior to that, in that industry, everybody was running very, very hard. There were other areas that kind of took that, and not specifically with the company I worked for either. I just mean across the industry. There were other areas that took the victim outlook. And so they really did nothing. But the fascinating thing was that during the next upturn, even the companies that were kind of poising themselves for that upturn, when the upturn started and profit margins started coming back and business started coming back, they reverted to that kind of fat and happy, for a lack of better terms, mentality. And some of those businesses, there were people that worked at them that were basically lost. They were getting a paycheck and doing something, but I don't know what they were doing, right? And so they went back to that. So I do find it fascinating how easy it is, even for a company, that goes through a change in their business level. When they get busy again, they can fall back into, that same pattern of complacency.
It's a type of muscle memory. So when you're in that complacent state and things are going well, it is kind of comfortable. And, no pain, no gain. If you want to continue to grow and maybe expand your margins, that's hard.
Yeah.
And it requires the leaders of a company to make hard decisions, which some do, some don't. And I found the bigger the corporation, the fewer and fewer people you have that are willing to make those type of hard decisions. Which is, I'll have to do some research on that. I also like to research things because that's what I've observed. So I have the empirical evidence, and I'm sure there's some other research evidence out there.
I kind of wonder as well. So, thinking back when we were all getting started, we were 19, 20 years old or 22, 23, you're getting out on your own. We all, I think everybody has had the experience of a time and point in their life where they lived, we'll say, paycheck to paycheck.
Yep.
And if you got a bonus, at that period in your life and you had that extra money, you went out and got things that maybe you felt you needed. And so it's kind of that same mentality. Whereas now, I think as you mature in your career and in your life, later you realize, oh, if I got a bonus, I can spend a little bit of that and I should save some of that. And, I should. And my point is that mentality, I think, is the same mentality that rolls across to we're really successful right now. It doesn't matter how much copy paper we buy. I'm just using that as an example.
That's a great example.
But boy, when times are tough, why are we running so many colored copies? Why do we need paper? Why do we, and so it's so interesting that when times are good, you don't pay attention to those things. And I always encourage people from a consulting standpoint, when I'm looking at financials, I question good financials as much as I question bad financials. If you have a really good month, I want to go through with a fine-tooth comb exactly the same as I do when I'm having a really bad month.
Yep. And so I built this framework for management, and one of the core management activities is measuring and modifying. So what did we plan to do? Okay, now let's go back and look at what happened and say, is this as good as we could have been? And that's a relative term, right? If you're good, you can be better. I think that was your point, right? They had a good month, quote unquote. Well, who said it was good? Like by what metric did you decide that was good versus how good could it be? I'll tell you a funny story because when you talked about copier paper. So early on in my career, I was a salesman. And I'm calling on a wholesale grocer, if you're familiar with that business.
Yep.
Super low margins. So I'm talking to the guy that was, I don't know, the buyer or whatever title he had. And he says, hey, you live down by a Sam's Club. I'm like, yes, I do. He was in some really small town in West Virginia. He said, will you come up to see me once a month? Could you load your trunk up with copier paper? Because you can buy it 20% cheaper than I can get it here locally. And I'm like, are you serious? He's like, oh yeah. He's like, I watch every penny that's spent in this business. So when I was going up to see, the wholesale grocer, I loaded up my trunk with copier paper. And he would tell me, like, we need this many cases, blah, 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 blah. He was a great customer, so he didn't mind doing it for me. He was a really good guy. But it was that mentality, because that's a really hard business. When you're measuring your margins in single digits,
Yep.
You don't waste money.
Yeah.
And that's the painful thing I see when you're starting to measure your margins up in the 60, 70, 80% range. There's a whole lot less scrutiny on the spending.
Yes. I am curious, back to your point of how you measure that, and is it as good as it could have been? A great friend of mine, Jimmy Green from Michigan, I've heard him say multiple times, he'll ask the question, well, what if it was supposed to be great? Yep. And so how do you work your way through? Maybe you're a beginning manager and you are in that role, maybe being given goals, but many times I've seen it happen over and over again. You're given a goal and not a metric.
Correct.
So
that's I was just working on this yesterday. There's a difference between a goal and a target.
Yep.
A goal's this big thing. We're headed in this direction. So leaders set goals. Managers drill in on targets. So okay, this month we are going to have a gross margin of X, 50. We're going to have a net margin of 38. Well, that's not hard to understand. People can wrap their head around those numbers. At the goal of, he's like, we want margin expansion. Okay, you got to break it down to the numbers and say every point percentage of margin, this is how it derives. So I call it the due to analysis. This result is due to these factors. And when you isolate those factors, then you can get people really keenly focused on them. Yeah, so this goes back to my big corporate days. We get a new CFO in. Great guy. He used to get to the office at 6:30 every day to read the Wall Street Journal. I was an early office guy, so I used to stop by and see him in the morning and have coffee and talk about what was in the Wall Street Journal. So he says to me, oh, you've been here for a while. He's like, why do we have so many consultants? I'm like, I have no idea. Nobody's ever asked about it before. So he pulls his computer up, flips around. He's like, do you know how much we spend on consultants? I'm like, I have no idea. He's like, nobody else does either. And he did an across-the-board mandate. Any consulting spend over $5,000, which is nothing, even at that time. You can't get somebody to come out to see you for $5,000. Had to go to him for approval. The consulting spend just collapsed. So then he was explaining to me, because it was a publicly traded company, he's like, okay, here's how you do the math to go backwards from your earnings per share to what every increase in your earnings per share number means to the stock value. And he's like writing this stuff down and teaching me this. I'm like, I don't know enough about corporate finance, obviously. He was a super nice guy. He was, CFO of the company. I was many levels down, but he was a helpful guy in terms of taking time to sit down to explain, this is really how the company works.
Yep.
And he was into the details, which that's the other thing I see for companies that are cash starved. They get keenly focused on the details. Companies that have a bit more fat, I'll use that word, they get less keenly focused on the details and start to get interested in other possibly distracting things. So,
thinking, kind of flipping it back around, thinking about from leadership standpoint, what are the most common overlooked things that companies should be looking at whenever they are training new managers? From a leadership standpoint, we've been talking from a manager standpoint, but from a leadership standpoint, what should you be thinking about when you're bringing a new manager on board?
So, and I'll readily admit my bias here, Amos.
Yep.
If you look at Gallup, right? Gallup does employee surveys every year. The number one thing at the top of that employee survey every year as a gap or an outage is communication.
Yep.
My manager doesn't communicate frequently enough. They don't give me enough details. That is how you transform a manager into a leader. Leaders communicate well. And oh, by the way, you don't show up at work knowing how to communicate. It's a skill. You can teach somebody how to do that. But that's where I look at this overlap between leadership and management. It's not flowery rhetoric up and make this super inspiring speech. I'm going to talk about things that really matter to the business, because if you understand the business going through the levels, the super majority of the people in an organization, they don't aspire to be the CEO. They don't aspire to be a VP. They come to work and do work. So the way I look at communication, because it's a common outage with organizations, how do you translate a strategy into a plan? And there's two levels of plans. There's tactical plans, there's operational plans. How do you translate that strategy so you're not losing the message? Because one of the things I had some success with over the course of my career was making people feel like they were part of something bigger. No, you're not just the staff accountant. You contribute to the success of this $2 billion company. What you do is super important. Let me explain to you why. And people they got motivated by that because then they had a purpose. I'm part of something big. Well, that's a communication skill. You can't say, well, you have to close the books in 3 days at the end of every financial month. Yeah, okay, that is a target. Why do you have to do that? What is the why behind that? When you explain the why to them, then you see people say, yes, what I do, the work I do when I come in here in the morning is important to the success of this organization. And that to me is it's leadership, but you're laying that leadership over management mechanics, for lack of a better word.
Yep.
And that's how you can engage people at all different levels of an organization.
So it was recently, yesterday, I was thinking about this and working with someone. And the reality is, like, you spent 30 years in the corporate world and you had different roles there. And I'm sure at some point you had a role where you had to create some sort of policy of some sort for your department, for the business. Now, looking back on that, your memories and your thoughts of that business, like, or even you think of your first job, are you ever going to say, boy, I wrote an amazing vacation policy, or I wrote an amazing sick leave policy. That was my legacy of where I was. And my point is, nobody's going to look back at their experience at a business and remember a policy or remember a net profit or remember, any of those things. What they're going to remember are the interactions they had and how they felt on a daily basis of what they were doing. And to your point, did it fit into the bigger picture? Did they feel part of the organization and what was happening? Why, and the Gallup poll and all of those places where communication is at the top. We've been talking about communication for 40 years in leadership, and we can't seem to get it. So 60% of the training I do is about communication. What are we missing? What's your thoughts? Why are we struggling so much? Is it information overload? Is it, the way we're raised? What do you think?
There's a couple different things. Let me pull that apart a little bit, Amos. What's missing is, I think people misunderstand motivation. Motivation is not some rah-rah speech. Motivation is giving people a purpose. You've heard people talk about this, that Simon Sinek has that YouTube video watched a gazillion times called Find the Why.
Yep.
And okay, but you got to give people a purpose they can relate to. And a purpose you can relate to, if you're somebody sitting out in a warehouse, is when I do my job well and all of our trucks ship on time, we get paid faster and we don't get demurrage charges, waiting charges from our customers, blah, 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 blah. It helps them understand where they fit in the bigger picture. And what I've found is when you supply people with purpose, they motivate themselves. You don't have to go in and give them a big rah-rah speech. You go in and give them, here's the purpose. When you fulfill this purpose, these are the benefits that accrue to the organization, and then by extension to you. Well, people are usually receptive to what's in it for me. And if you can marry those two things together, but it changes the messaging a little bit. That keep driving people back to the purpose so that they think, they feel, that's the right word, they feel like they're part of something big. That really is in my mind, that's a crucial thing for leaders to do. And are you a John Maxwell guy? You like John Maxwell?
Yes, I'm actually a certified Maxwell speaker, coach, and consultant.
Well, you're in the leadership space, so I figured John Maxwell is one of the few people I've seen put in writing. You know a leader because they have followers. So position does not make you a leader. It's moving people in a unified, focused direction. That's a leader. But people say, okay, I see what that person's doing. I observe how they're interacting with me and talking to me. I'm going to follow that person. They're taking us in the right direction. And this is where the manager thing and the leadership thing come apart. If the manager's just in pounded on the desk about something that happened last week, that's not super motivating.
Yep.
If a leader is in talking about, we're going to do this and this is what's going to happen next week, that gets people fired up.
I have said hundreds of times, I tell people that when you get a job title, there are no magical powers that come with that. And I've heard many times somebody say, well, I would be, if they would give me the title, I could do this. Or maybe they're in a role, but they feel that they're underpaid. And they say, if I had $10,000 more a year, I would be an amazing leader. And what I always encourage people is that's not true.
Transactional.
Yeah, that's not what a leader, is in today's world. You have, through your company, you have Management Mastery Solutions, and you guys have a system to start to help managers to be able to gain some of these skills and companies to be able to produce better managers. So can you share with us a little bit about how does that system actually work?
Sure. I'll take this in two pieces, and you'll see how it ties together then. So I use a simple Venn diagram, and I say, okay, in the left-hand circle, you have management skills. In the right-hand circle, you have leadership skills. When you overlap these things, you will see there's this common set of skills. So in places where you find people talking differently about leaders than managers, they haven't done that work. So what we do is I created this, I developed it over the years. I was working with managers. I call it the management framework. It's a circle. In the middle of that circle is communication. That's where you start. But then if you go to 12 o'clock on the circle, you have planning. You move around to 3 o'clock, you have people management. You move down to 6 o'clock, you have direction setting. And then over at 9 o'clock, you have measuring and modifying. Those are the core functions of management. You go back and study this. The thing that was always missing that I observed was the communication part. Communication is what synthesizes all those core management functions. It pulls them together, it ties them together. And that's what, if you're doing those 5 things, magically, people start saying, well, that person's a great leader. They talk to me all the time. And they talk to me about my job and what I do, and I feel good about that. So, a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet, those are facts. Nobody's going to get super excited about that. If people feel like you understand their job and you make them feel important, all of a sudden they're like, well, that person's a great leader. Well, anybody could do that, but you need to train people a little bit so they do that.
Yep.
And it's fascinating to watch when people embrace this, how differently they come back and say, well, people are treating me differently at work. Yes, they are, because you're now different. So they're going to treat you differently.
So kind of to reiterate that or summarize it for our listeners, and I'm going to word it slightly differently, but what came to mind for me is when you take these different areas and you start to work on all of them, it's kind of like looking through a camera lens. And if you're manually focusing that camera lens, everything starts to come into focus, or congruence, that now everything is starting to work together and work, everything, all those pieces are coming together. And everybody has a great understanding now of who the leader is at that point, and a manager is naturally becoming a leader at that point. Did I summarize that properly?
Yes, and that is the progression. So I like to make visuals up for people because their brains work that way. So you look at a 4-layer cake, right? The bottom layer of that cake is you're an individual contributor. You go up 1 layer, they're a manager of things. You go up another layer, now you're a manager of a function. Well, as you go up those layers, the leadership part becomes more and more important. At the individual contributor level, you can demonstrate personal responsibility and do all those things to be a great employee. Once you hit that manager level and people are looking at you saying, well, I have expectations of this person, being a pure numbers-driven manager, policy-driven manager, whatever it is, isn't going to get you there anymore. You need to start laying on these leadership qualities. Don't forget the management qualities. They're really important. That's how the company makes money. But you're not moving an organization unless you're also layering on. So then you get up to the very top level of this 4-layer cake. You're responsible for an enterprise. And you got to figure out how to get all these people throughout the hierarchy to work together. That's more of a leadership job than it is a management job. They don't work together mechanically.
Yep.
So.
And one of the things in our business, we really stress the point that there's a difference between communication and connection. And yep. I think, you've hit on it as well. A spreadsheet, a PowerPoint presentation, it's not, those statistics are not going to help you connect with anybody. And no. I think it often comes down to, genuinely talking, understanding, and sharing. Just recently I did a piece talking about the pure point that statistics aren't going to connect with anybody, but if you tell a story, you can utilize those statistics in the story. You can still get your message across. But I think that's, a key thing for our listeners to kind of think about. What you're describing is that they need to learn to connect with people on top of managing them, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I was a quantitative analyst earlier in my career. I do like numbers and spreadsheets. Then I went into sales. But I'm doing all this analysis on sales data. So guys are like, hey, I want you to come out and talk to my customer. This is you're familiar with New Jersey or on that part of the country, on that side of the country.
Yep.
These guys were all individual business owners. So there's a big consortium of them. So I went in, I'm like, hey, I'm the guy from the home office. I'm a number cruncher. I'm like, as I crunched a bunch of your numbers, and here's one chart I want you to look at. And so I'm showing them a sales number. I'm like, here's your single takeaway from this. If you do more of this, you'll get more of that. And the more of this was put product on display and run ads. That was profit. I said, now I could show you reams of statistics on that, or you can just do more of this and get more of that. And one guy starts laughing. He's like, we want more of that. What do we have to do? So it's statistics. They didn't care. They believed that I had them. The one guy actually called me up after the meeting. He's like, I actually like numbers. I'd like you to come in and sit down and talk with me and take apart my business. I'd be happy to do that. That's what I do. But the rest of them, no.
So you are also a huge advocate of continuous learning. I know I looked at a couple of pieces that you have out just kind of talking about that idea of continuous learning, specifically in management. Why do you think that is so important? And how does a manager, and I'm thinking about that person that's getting started as a manager, they're already busy. They have all of these things they're trying to accomplish. How do they fit in, and how do they prioritize continuing to learn?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because particularly when you're a new manager, there is a certain feeling of overwhelm there. I have to learn how to do this. I have to learn. You do need to get people to separate a little bit and say, you're not always going to be in that role. And this is where, and I believe pretty strongly in this is where mentors come in. MENTOR, mentor.
Yep.
And they can help people see that path. Like, look, you're not always going to be buried at your desk. If you do these things and start to understand the organization at a higher level and the levers and the mechanics of how that works, you can start to see your way through that. And they can also, to some extent, curate the information you might want to focus on a little bit more. because they were where you are now, however many years ago. And what's your experience with mentorship? I've seen it done well, and I've seen it done checking the box style.
So I might have a slightly different look at mentorship. One, I truly believe everybody should have a mentor, but I also believe that a mentor is it is a relationship where neither person is getting paid for that.
Absolutely.
And because sometimes we confuse that, and people say, well, I need a mentor. And I've even had people come to me as McCoy Leadership and say, I really would like a mentor. Can I sign up? Can I pay you to be my mentor? And you can pay me to be your coach.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
I can't be, you can't pay me to be your mentor. So I think that's the first step. And the second piece is you want somebody to be your mentor that is not necessarily directly related to your success, because they could become biased. So there's maybe two different styles of mentor. I've seen businesses that have mentor programs within the business. And I think they maybe just should be called something different. They can be effective and helpful, but they're not a true mentorship program. And so I think the best thing that you can do is look for somebody in your community, in your church, in your, around you, Rotary Club, whatever the case may be. Find that person and then just ask them, can I have 30 minutes of time once a month, get started, and you seem to be successful and you're where I want to be someday.
Yep.
Can I talk to you? And that's how a true mentorship program gets started. And then selfishly, I would say for all of our listeners that are maybe in leadership roles in places where they're placing people, probably one of the best things you could do is just promote our podcast and make all your employees listen to our podcast. I mean, because that would be perfect, right?
Right, because you are definitely an external source of information that's not directly related to their future career success. Now, I would look at it differently and say, no, it is related to your future career success. If you're a lifetime learner, you'll read a book to get one good idea.
Yes. Now,
but then you won't hold on to that. You'll share that information with as many people as you can.
Yep.
Say, hey, I read this book. You don't have to read it. Here's the one really good idea. Let's start doing this.
You got it. And I was being, somewhat funny about saying, force people to listen to our podcast. But my real point is that there's nothing more valuable, back to the connection piece. You have somebody, and I had a boss at the very beginning of my career that would quite often read a magazine article, write a note and say, to my initials are AAM. He would always put to AAM from JWN. And it was something interesting. And my point is that meant something to me because he thought about me. He knew where maybe I needed or what I was working on at that point in time. So even in today's world, passing on a podcast or a book or something to someone, just like you said, but making it personal helps with that connection as well.
Yeah, to this day, I do that. And I'll tell you a quick story of where I picked this up. So you're familiar with Ram Charan?
Yeah.
He's a guy that's been described as the CEO coach or whatever. And I had breakfast with him one time, only because I get up really early. He's sitting by himself at a table, and I knew who he was. I had his books. So I walked over and said, hey, do you mind if I join you for coffee? Oh, sure, sit down. I'm like, oh, I see you're looking at the Wall Street Journal. I said, yeah, I read that in the morning too. He's like, well, I read it with intent. He's like, I know a lot of people. He's like, the exact thing you described. He said, if I see things that say, oh, this would help that person, I send it to them. He's like, I do it every morning. I'm like, this guy's about 1 million times more successful than me. And this is how he thinks. I should probably take something away from that.
Yes.
So unfortunately, it happened relatively early in my career, but I've been doing that. I sent a Wall Street Journal article to a guy yesterday. Said, hey, I know you're working with somebody that's doing this. Read this in paragraph 3. That's a piece of information you need. for the fellow you're working with.
Yep.
And is there anything in that for me? No. But it's helping him, and it's going to help him with somebody he's working with. So there's no, there's no immediate payback for that, but you feel good about doing it. That's a payback.
And you're growing your circle of influence. Back to the old Covey principle. That's really what you're doing. So as we're getting ready to come to a close, one of the most important pieces is, where can people find out more about you? If they're interested, they want to engage, they want to know more about your system, where can they find that?
So we have this really fancy name because, as I mentioned when we were talking earlier, my wife does the marketing side of the business, and she's more creative than I am.
Yes.
So our website is Management Mastery, all one word, .solutions. We actually had to go out and wait for that .solutions URL to become available to secure it.
Okay.
So it's managementmastery.solutions, and I'm on LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, I am Greg Kaiser Sr., because there's also a professional Greg Kaiser Jr. running around out there. Got
it. Well, as we come to an end, we always ask all of our guests 3 questions, kind of rapid fire at the end. I ask the same 3 questions. I said when I get to, a couple hundred episodes out, we're going to publish that and become, insanely wealthy from all of these answers to these questions. I'm kidding. But the first question really is derived around conversations over, I would say, the past 15 to 20 years with business owners and leaders. We often hear things such as, when I was in high school, they taught us this and they don't teach it anymore. Or, the students coming to us today don't have this. And so the question is, if we could magically get all of the school administrators across the world into one room, and you had a moment to give them one piece of advice of something that they could add or do differently within a student's public school career, any school career, what would that one thing be?
Yes, I will tell you, Amos, I'm a little biased here. I teach religious education classes to middle schoolers.
Yep.
Because nobody else wanted the job.
Yes.
But be that as it may, the one thing that I go back to is, you need to lay a foundation, the fundamentals. What are you going to build on from here? So I was one of the unfortunate people that was in school back in the 1960s when they switched to the new math. I'm not good at math now.
Yep.
And it's because of the way that it was taught. They got some cutesy idea that they're going to veer into this new math thing. Well, now if you it sounds like you do follow education.
Yes.
Around the country, I see a big move back to fundamentals. Hey, we have to teach phonics.
Yep.
The CSA thing didn't work out so good. Those types of things. So that would be the one thing for the education folks. Go back to the fundamentals, but also you have to lay out for people, this is going to build to something much bigger. If you understand how to diagram a sentence in 7th grade, you're going to be a much better writer when you get to high school and college.
Yep.
That's why we do this.
Yeah. I guess, thinking about what you just said, what ran through my mind was a question of, what is the finished product we're trying to put out? And are we really, true to what we say we want? And,
yes.
So
that's another Covey thing, begin with the end in mind, right?
Exactly. So the second question is, throughout your career, what has been your go-to book that you've continually went back to and has given you good insights?
The Effective Executive by Peter Drucker. So when I was a manager and got to be an executive and so on, I always had a dozen copies of that in my office. My admin knew. She would come in and take the little inventory, see how many I had given out, and reorder them. So there was always a dozen copies there. That is an absolutely fabulous book for a manager at any level. That's how good it is. You could be a CEO and read that book and say, I've drifted away from that. I need to go back to that. Or you could be a new manager and read it and say, well, I didn't know any of this stuff, so I'm going to put it all to work for me and be a lot better.
Yep.
That's just a fabulous book.
I like it. Last question is, in all of the things that are available to us today from a technological and software standpoint, what is your favorite piece of technology or software that you find useful today?
Yes, I am a software and technology junkie, if you will. I love new software things. So I've been using AI quite a bit.
Yep.
Because people are all freaked out by AI. Like, no, it's not that different than Excel was back in the early 80s, okay? Nobody's doing general ledger accounting anymore by hand.
Yep.
All that stuff, at first it migrated into spreadsheets, then it went into enterprise packages. I look at AI the same way. Yeah, they're having some startup glitches and you got these hallucinations in the answers. Well, that just tells you need to be a smarter user of it. My wife and I have both taken some courses on it. I view it as a productivity tool. It's a productivity tool that, there's probably a few more caveats you need to look at. But I don't see how going forward it's going to be possible to lead at higher levels if you don't understand and engage with it. Because, oh, by the way, people in your organization are already doing that. So you need to understand how it works.
Yep. I like it. Well, thank you so much, Greg, for joining us today. I've had a lot of fun. Hopefully we can get you back on in the future and maybe dive a little bit deeper. But
absolutely.
Yes, thank you. And for our listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to look back at some past episodes. And don't forget to follow us on whatever platform you're listening so that you can get updates when new episodes come out each week. Until next time, we appreciate you.